Have you ever walked past someone on the street and wondered what story lies behind their weathered face? What if the man you barely noticed, the one huddled under a bridge with nothing but a tattered blanket, carried a secret so profound it could shatter every assumption you've ever made? What if that same man, forgotten by the world, once stood tall as a hero in a battlefield far from home, underneath the shadow of the old steel bridge crossing the Mississippi River in St. Louis, Missouri, where the muddy waters churn and the distant hum of freight trains echoes through the night, lives a man named John Carver. Most folks don't see him. They hurry past, clutching their Starbucks cups on chilly mornings, their eyes fixed on the grey pavement or their glowing phone screens. To them, John's just another ghost in a city full of them, a shadow blending into the graffiti-scarred concrete and the rusted iron girders overhead. But if you stopped for just a moment, if you really looked, you'd see something different. You'd see the way his hands tremble, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something that clings to him like the dampness of the river air. You'd see the faint scar running jagged across his left cheek, a silent testament to a life once lived at the edge of survival. And if the light hit just right, you'd catch the glint of dog tags tucked beneath his frayed jacket. Dog tags he hasn't taken off in over a decade, as if they're the last tether to a version of himself he can never reclaim. John Carver is 53 years old, though the years on the street have carved deeper lines into his face, making him look closer to 70. His beard is a patchy grey streaked with dirt, and his eyes, once sharp and commanding, now carry a hollow glaze, like the windows of an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. He's been under this bridge for nearly 5 years, ever since the VA benefits dried up, and the nightmares grew too loud to drown out with cheap whiskey. Every morning, as the sun creeps over the gateway arch in the distance, casting golden streaks across the river, John wakes to the same ache in his bones and the same ache in his chest. He pulls himself up, his worn-out army boots scuffing against the gravel, and begins his quiet ritual of survival in a city that moves on without him. His spot under the bridge is a patchwork of scavenged belongings, a cardboard mat that smells of mildew, a torn sleeping bag he found behind a dumpster near Busch Stadium after a Cardinals game, and a small tin can where he keeps a handful of coins tossed by the rare passerby who meets his gaze. There's a faded photo tucked into the lining of his jacket too, a grainy snapshot of him in uniform, standing shoulder to shoulder with his platoon in the deserts of Iraq, all of them grinning like they still believed in forever. He doesn't look at it often. It hurts too much, not just because of the men who didn't come back, but because of the man he used to be, someone who knew how to stand tall, how to lead, how to believe in something bigger than himself. Now that man feels like a stranger, buried under layers of dust and despair. John's days are a grind, a slow march through the underbelly of St. Louis. He shuffles along the riverfront, past the tourist boats blaring jazz tunes and the families snapping selfies with the arch looming behind them. He keeps his head down as he passes the street vendors, hawking hot dogs and pretzels, the smell of grilled meat twisting his empty stomach into knots. Sometimes he'll linger near the Soulard Market, hoping to snag a bruised apple or a half-eaten sandwich from a trash bin before the crows get to it. Other times, he'll sit on a splintered bench near Lafayette Square, watching kids kick soccer balls and couples stroll hand in hand, their laughter cutting through him like a dull blade. He doesn't begrudge them their happiness, not really. It's just that every smile, every carefree giggle reminds him of what he's lost, of the life he thought he'd have after the war, a life with a white picket fence, a barbecue in the backyard, and Sunday mornings at church with a family of his own. But beneath the surface of this broken routine, there's a storm brewing inside John, a quiet tempest he can't outrun no matter how many miles he walks or how many sleepless nights he endures. It's in the way his hands clench into fists when a car backfires near the bridge, the sound yanking him back to the crack of gunfire in Fallujah. It's in the way he flinches at the sight of 4th of July fireworks, the bright bursts over the Mississippi dragging him straight back to the explosions that stole his brothers in arms. And it's in the dreams, God, the dreams, that come every night without fail, vivid flashes of sand and blood and screams, of holding a young soldier's hand as the life drained from his eyes under a scorching desert sun. John wakes from these nightmares drenched in sweat, his heart pounding like a war drum, and he lies there on his cardboard bed, staring up at the underbelly of the bridge, wondering if he'll ever sleep through the night again. He doesn't talk about it. Not to the other folks who camp out near the river, not to the social workers who occasionally stop by with bottled water and pamphlets for shelters, and certainly not to the rare stranger who mumbles a "thank you for your service" before dropping a crumpled dollar into his tin can. What's there to say? That he once led a squad through hell and came out the other side a shell of himself. That the medals he earned, the ones he keeps buried in his mind like landmines, mean nothing when he can't even afford a hot meal at the end of the day. No, John keeps his pain locked tight, a rusted cage around his heart, and he trudges on day after day, telling himself that this is just how it is now. This is just how it has to be. Sometimes, though, there are glimmers of something else, of the man he used to be, stubborn and unyielding, clawing to the surface like a weed through cracked asphalt. On Thursdays, when the local church sets up a soup kitchen near Forest Park, John makes the long walk there, not just for the watery stew and stale bread, but for the chance to sit among people, to hear voices that aren't just echoes in his head. He doesn't say much, just nods when someone offers a tired "hey buddy," but he listens. He listens to the old-timers grumble about the Cardinals' losing streak, to the volunteers humming gospel tunes under their breath, to the murmur of life still moving forward, even when his own feels stuck in quicksand. And every once in a while, he'll catch himself almost smiling, almost reaching for a memory of better days, like the time he and his platoon celebrated Thanksgiving in a dusty tent, passing around a can of cranberry sauce and cracking jokes about who'd burned the MREs. But the moment always fades, swallowed by the weight of everything that came after. Most days, John sticks to his solitary routine, keeping to the shadows of the city like he's hiding from something or someone. He avoids the busy intersections where veterans sometimes panhandle with cardboard signs, scrawled with their service history, not because he's ashamed, but because putting his pain on display feels like betrayal, like cheapening the sacrifices he made. Instead, he spends hours walking along the levee, the river's current a steady companion, or sitting under the bridge, carving little notches into a stick with a dull pocket knife, counting the days since he last felt whole. He tells himself he's fine, that he's surviving, that he doesn't need anyone. But deep down in the quiet corners of his mind, there's a whisper, a desperate, aching whisper, that maybe there's still something worth fighting for, something worth remembering. It was on one of those grey, drizzly afternoons in late October, when the air smelled of wet leaves and the first bite of winter, that John's world tilted on its axis. He was crouched under the bridge, his fingers numb as he tried to fold a piece of cardboard into a better shield against the wind, when he heard it. A soft, tentative sound cutting through the distant roar of traffic. Footsteps. Not the hurried clack of a commuter or the heavy tread of a cop checking the area, but something smaller, lighter, almost hesitant. John's body tensed, an old instinct kicking in, his hand instinctively brushing against the pocket where he kept his knife. He didn't turn around right away, didn't want to spook whoever it was, but he listened, his ears straining for any sign of threat. Then came a voice, small and quivering, like a leaf trembling in the wind. "Mister, are you okay down here?" John froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly he lifted his head, his stiff neck creaking as he turned to face the source of the sound. Standing just a few feet away, framed by the dim light filtering through the bridge's overhang, was a boy, no older than 10 or 11, with a mop of sandy hair peeking out from under a St. Louis Blues cap. He wore a puffy red jacket, unzipped despite the chill, and his sneakers were scuffed, one lace untied. In his small hands he clutched something, a crumpled envelope, yellowed at the edges, with faint handwriting scrawled across the front. John's eyes narrowed, his gut twisting with a strange, uneasy feeling he couldn't name. "I'm fine, kid," John rasped, his voice rough from disuse, sounding more like a growl than he meant it to. "You shouldn't be down here. It ain't safe. Go on home." But the boy didn't move. He just stood there, shifting from one foot to the other, his big brown eyes wide with something between fear and determination. I found this," he stammered, holding out the envelope like it was a lifeline. "It's got your name on it. John Carver, that's you, right? My grandpa, he said if I ever saw you, I had to give it to you. He said it's important." John's heart slammed against his ribcage, a cold sweat breaking out across his brow despite the autumn chill. His name. How did this kid know his name? And who was this grandpa? Some ghost from a past he'd spent years trying to bury. He stared at the envelope, at the shaky cursive spelling out John Carver in faded ink. And for a moment, the world seemed to shrink, the sounds of the river and the city fading into a dull hum. That handwriting, it tugged at something deep inside him, a memory he couldn't grasp, like a half-forgotten dream slipping through his fingers. He reached out, his scarred hand trembling more than ever, and took the envelope from the boy, his fingers brushing against the worn paper as if it might burn him. As he held it, something inside him cracked open, a fissure in the dam he'd built around his heart. Because there on the back of the envelope was a name, scratched in the same shaky hand, a name he hadn't seen or spoken in over 15 years. Sergeant Daniel "Danny" Harper, his best friend, his brother in arms. The man who'd saved his life more times than he could count, only to lose his own on a dusty road outside Baghdad. John's breath hitched, his vision blurring as the weight of that name crashed over him like a tidal wave. Danny was gone. He'd been gone for years. So how could this be? How could a letter from a dead man find him now under a bridge in St. Louis, delivered by a kid who shouldn't even know who he was? What is this? John whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes locked on the envelope as if it held the answers to every question he'd ever buried. The boy took a small step back, sensing the storm brewing in the man before him, but he didn't run. Instead, he squared his shoulders, his young face set with a stubbornness that reminded John of someone he used to know, someone he used to be. "My grandpa said you'd know what it means," the boy said softly, almost reverently. "He said you're a hero, and heroes, they don't forget." Those words hit John like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from his lungs. A hero. He hadn't felt like a hero in years, not since the day he'd walked away from the VA hospital, with nothing but a duffel bag and a shattered mind. But as he clutched the letter, as he felt the weight of Danny's name burning into his palm, something stirred inside him, a flicker of the man he'd once been, a man who'd earned the highest honor the army could give, a man who'd sworn to never leave a brother behind. And now, under the shadow of this cold, unforgiving bridge, with a boy's earnest eyes on him and a ghost from the past whispering through faded ink, John Carver felt the ground shift beneath him. Whatever was in that letter, whatever truth it held, he knew one thing for certain. His life, the life he thought was over, might just be starting again. John Carver sat frozen under the shadow of the bridge, the envelope trembling in his scarred hands. The Mississippi River churned nearby, its murky waters a mirror to the storm raging inside him. The faded ink spelling out Danny Harper's name felt like a blade carving into his chest, each letter a jagged cut through the armor of numbness he'd worn for years. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, the cold October air biting at his lungs. How could this be real? Danny was gone, killed in action, buried in a flag-draped coffin, somewhere John hadn't had the strength to visit. Yet here was his name, scrawled in a handwriting John would recognize anywhere, a ghost reaching out from the grave to drag him back into a past he'd spent over a decade running from. His first instinct was to shove the letter back at the kid, to tell him to take it and never come back. But his fingers wouldn't let go. They gripped the brittle paper tighter, as if letting it slip away would mean losing Danny all over again. John's eyes stung, not from the damp wind whipping off the river, but from something deeper, something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Grief. Raw, unfiltered grief, mixed with a gnawing confusion that clawed at his mind. Why now? Why him? And who was this boy? Standing there with those big, earnest eyes, looking at John like he was something more than a broken husk of a man. "What do you know about this?" John's voice cracked, rough as the gravel under his boots, his gaze pinning the boy in place. "Who's your grandpa? How'd he know Danny? How'd he know me?" The boy, still shifting nervously from foot to foot, bit his lip, his small hands fidgeting with the zipper of his red jacket. "My grandpa's name is Walter. Walter Klein. He was in the army too, a long time ago. He talked about you sometimes, said you saved a lot of people, said you and Danny were like brothers. He's sick now, real sick, so he told me to find you. He said this letter, it's something you gotta read, something Danny wanted you to have." Each word landed like a grenade in John's chest, the shrapnel of memory tearing through him. Walter Klein. The name tugged at a buried corner of his mind, a face half remembered through the haze of war. Maybe a medic, maybe a supply officer, someone who'd been there in Iraq, in the chaos of those endless, sweltering days. But the mention of Danny wanting him to have this letter, it was too much. John's hands shook harder, the envelope crinkling under his grip. Danny had been his anchor, the one who'd kept him sane when the world was falling apart around them. They'd shared everything. Cigarettes under a desert sky, stories of home they'd never see again, the kind of bond forged only in the crucible of combat. And then Danny was gone, ripped away in a flash of fire and screams on a road that still haunted John's nightmares. How could there be something left of him, something John hadn't known about until this moment? I can't. John's voice broke, barely a whisper now, his head bowing as if the weight of the letter might crush him. Guilt surged up, black and bitter, coating his throat. He hadn't saved Danny. He'd been right there, just yards away when the IED detonated, and he hadn't been fast enough, strong enough, good enough to pull his brother out of the wreckage. That failure had followed him through every sleepless night, through every VA waiting room, through every bottle of cheap liquor he'd drained trying to forget. And now, holding this piece of Danny's ghost, the guilt was a living thing, gnawing at the edges of his soul. What if this letter blamed him? What if it held the words he'd dreaded hearing all these years? That he'd let Danny down, that he wasn't the hero everyone thought he was? The boy took a hesitant step forward, his sneakers crunching on the loose stones, his voice small but steady. Grandpa said you'd be scared to open it. He said sometimes the bravest thing ain't fighting, but facing what you've been running from. I don't know what that means, mister, but I think he's right. I think you should read it. John's head snapped up, his hollow eyes meeting the boy's. There was no judgment there, no pity, just a quiet, stubborn belief that cut through John like a knife. He wanted to lash out, to tell the kid he didn't know a damn thing about bravery or pain, to send him running back to whatever safe, warm home he came from. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, a memory flickered. Danny's voice, rough with laughter, telling him over a crackling radio in the middle of a firefight, "Come on, Carver, we don't run from nothing. You got this." That same stubborn belief echoed now in a child's voice under a cold St. Louis bridge. He looked down at the envelope again, his thumb brushing over the faded ink. The river's hum filled the silence, a relentless reminder of time slipping away. He could tear the letter up, scatter the pieces into the Mississippi, let them sink into the mud, and be done with it. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew he couldn't. Not because of the boy watching him, or even because of Walter Klein, whoever he was, but because of Danny. Because somewhere deep down, under the layers of dust and despair, John still owed him that much, to face whatever truth this letter held, no matter how much it hurt. With a trembling breath, John slid a dirt-streaked finger under the flap of the envelope, the paper tearing with a soft, brittle sound that seemed deafening in the stillness. Inside was a single sheet, folded into thirds, the handwriting cramped and uneven, as if written in a hurry or under strain. His chest tightened as he unfolded it, the words blurring for a moment before his vision cleared. The date at the top was from just days before Danny died, days before that last, fatal mission. John's heart thudded so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. "John," it began in Danny's familiar scrawl, "if you're reading this, I'm probably gone. I ain't good with words, you know that, but I had to write this anyway. I need you to know something, brother. What we've been through out here, it ain't just about surviving, it's about what we carry after. I've seen you take on more than any man should, and I know you'll blame yourself if something happens to me. Don't. You hear me? Don't you dare carry that weight. You saved me 100 times over in ways you don't even see. You're the best damn soldier I ever knew, and the best friend I ever had. If I don't make it, I want you to promise me something. Live. Not just for you, but for me too. Find a way to keep going, even when it feels impossible. I'm counting on you, Carver, always will be. Danny." John's hands shook so violently the paper nearly slipped from his grasp. His throat closed up, a sob clawing its way out despite his best effort to choke it down. Danny hadn't blamed him. He hadn't written a word of anger or regret. Instead, he'd given John a command, a mission to live, a mission John had failed every single day since he'd lost him. The guilt didn't vanish, but it twisted. morphing into something heavier, something like shame. He'd let Danny down not by failing to save him, but by giving up on himself, by hiding under this bridge while the world moved on without him. The boy was still there, watching silently, his young face etched with concern. John wiped a sleeve across his eyes, the coarse fabric scratching at his skin, and forced himself to speak, though his voice was raw. "How'd Walter get this? How'd it take so long to find me?" The boy swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the ground for a moment before meeting John's again. "Grandpa said Danny gave it to him before that last mission. Told him to hold on to it, just in case. Grandpa kept it all these years, said he tried to find you after the war, but you'd disappeared. He only figured out you were here a few months ago, when someone at the VA mentioned seeing a guy matching your description down by the river. He wanted to come himself, but he can't walk much anymore. So he sent me. He said it couldn't wait any longer." John's mind churned, piecing together the jagged edges of the story. Walter Klein, a forgotten name from a forgotten time, holding on to this letter like a sacred relic, waiting for the right moment, or maybe just the courage, to deliver it. And now through this kid, Danny's words had reached him, cutting deeper than any shrapnel ever could. The weight of it all pressed down on him, the bridge above seeming to loom heavier, the river's endless flow a taunt at how he'd let himself drift, untethered for so long. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into the envelope, though his hands still trembled. He couldn't look at the boy now, couldn't face those eyes that saw too much. Instead, he stared out at the Mississippi, the water catching the fading grey light of the afternoon. Somewhere in the distance, the gateway arch stood as a silent sentinel, a symbol of new beginnings and westward dreams, a symbol that felt mocking in its permanence, while John's own life had crumbled to ash. He'd walked past that arch 1,000 times since coming to St. Louis, always with his head down, never daring to look up at its shining curve. Now, though, it seemed to call to him, a quiet challenge to rise again, to be more than the shadow he'd become. But rising meant facing everything he'd buried. It meant looking at the dog tags still hanging heavy around his neck, the ones engraved with his name and the memory of the Silver Star, the highest honor he'd earned for dragging 3 wounded men to safety under enemy fire. That medal, tucked away in a pawn shop box somewhere after he'd sold it for a bottle and a bus ticket, had once meant something. It had meant he was a hero, a man worth something. Now it felt like a lie, a polished piece of metal that couldn't fix the rot inside him. Could he reclaim that man? Did he even deserve to try? The boy's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts, softer now, almost pleading. "Mister, Grandpa said there's more. Not just the letter. He said he's got something else for you, something Danny left with him, but you gotta come see him. He don't got much time left. Please, will you come?" John's gut twisted, a fresh wave of dread mixing with the grief already choking him. More. There was more to this, more pieces of a past he wasn't sure he could face. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to stay here under the bridge where the world couldn't touch him, where the pain was familiar, if not bearable. But then he thought of Danny's words, "Live. Not just for you, but for me too." He thought of the boy's determined face, of Walter Klein waiting somewhere in this city, clinging to life and to promises made long ago. And he thought of the men he'd lost, the ones whose names were etched into his nightmares, who deserved more than a broken soldier hiding from their memory. He pushed himself to his feet, his knees protesting, his body heavy with years of neglect. The boy stepped back, a flicker of hope lighting his eyes, though John's face remained a mask of stone. Inside, though, a battle raged, fear against duty, despair against the faint, stubborn spark of who he used to be. He slipped the envelope into the lining of his jacket, next to the faded photo of his platoon, the weight of it grounding him even as it burned. He didn't know if he was ready for whatever waited ahead, didn't know if he could face Walter or the ghosts that would come with him. But for the first time in years, he felt something stir, a need, a pull to do right by Danny, even if it tore him apart in the process. "All right, kid," John rasped, his voice low, almost lost to the wind off the river. "Take me to him, but I ain't promising nothing after that, you understand?" The boy nodded eagerly, a small relieved smile breaking through his nervous expression. "Yes, sir. It's not far. Just up near Lafayette Square. I'll show you. John took a final glance at the river, at the dark, ceaseless current that had been his only companion for so long. Then he turned away, his worn-out army boots crunching on the gravel as he followed the boy out from under the bridge, each step heavier than the last. The city loomed before him, its skyline punctuated by the gateway arch, gleaming even in the dim light, a reminder of journeys begun, of burdens carried across vast distances. He didn't know if this was the start of redemption or just another chapter of pain, but he knew one thing. There was no turning back now. Danny's words echoed in his head, a mission he couldn't refuse, a weight he had to bear no matter the cost. As they walked, the boy glanced up at him, hesitant but curious. "Mister, you ever think about telling your story? Like to people who'd listen? I bet a lot of folks would want to know." John's jaw tightened, the idea of exposing his scars to the world like a cheap roadside attraction turning his stomach. But he didn't snap at the kid. Instead, he grunted, his voice gruff, but not unkind. "Maybe someday, kid. For now, let's just get to your grandpa." And to anyone out there watching this unfold, if John's struggle, his fight to reclaim himself, hits you somewhere deep, make sure to subscribe. There's more to this story, more pain, more hope, and you won't want to miss what comes next. But for John, as he trudged through the chilly streets of St. Louis, the boy at his side, and the letter burning a hole in his jacket, the future was a fog he couldn't see through. Every step toward Lafayette Square felt like marching back into a war zone, back to the sand and blood and loss he'd never escaped. Walter Klein waited there, a man tied to a past John had buried, holding secrets or relics or God knows what that Danny had left behind. John's mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. What if it was a keepsake, a final piece of Danny that would shatter him all over again? What if it was a truth he couldn't handle, a confession or a debt he didn't know he owed? His chest ached, not just from the cold or the years of hard living, but from the fear of what he'd find at the end of this road. He'd spent so long running, from the VA, from the memories, from himself, that standing still, facing it head-on, felt like stepping into a minefield. The boy kept glancing at him, as if sensing the storm brewing under his weathered exterior, but John kept his eyes forward, his face a mask. He couldn't let this kid see how close he was to breaking, how every fiber of him screamed to turn around and disappear back under the bridge. They passed through familiar streets, past the splintered benches where John had watched carefree lives unfold, past the riverfront where the jazz boats still played their tunes for tourists who never noticed him. The city felt different now, sharper, as if Danny's letter had stripped away the grey filter he'd seen it through for years. Every sound, the honk of a distant car, the laugh of a passerby, grated on him, reminders of a world he'd checked out of. But he kept walking, his boots scuffing against the sidewalk, driven by a force he couldn't name. Duty, maybe, or guilt, or the ghost of a promise made to a brother he'd never stop owing. When they finally reached the edge of Lafayette Square, the boy slowed, pointing toward a narrow street lined with aging brick row houses, their windows glowing with warm light against the gathering dusk. "It's just down there," he said, his voice tinged with both relief and nervousness. "Number 14, Grandpa'll be waiting." John stopped, his breath catching as he looked down that street. It was just a few hundred yards, but it might as well have been a battlefield stretching out before him. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, the envelope in his jacket a lead weight against his chest. He could still walk away. He could tell the kid thanks, but no thanks, disappear back to the river, let Walter and whatever he held fade into the past where they belonged. But then he felt it, the faint cold metal of his dog tags shifting under his shirt. A reminder of the man he'd been, the man who'd earned the Silver Star, who'd led and lost and fought with everything he had. And he heard Danny's voice again, clear as if he were standing right there. "Live, not just for you, but for me too." His jaw set, a tremor of resolve cutting through the fear. He looked at the boy, his voice low, final. "Let's get this over with." The decision hung in the air, heavy as the Mississippi fog, as John took the first step down that narrow street. Whatever waited at number 14, be it answers, pain, or a piece of Danny he'd thought long buried, it would change everything. There was no hiding anymore, no running. For the first time in years, John Carver was marching towards something, not away, and the weight of that choice was enough to crack his heart wide open. Whether it would heal or shatter, only time would tell. But one thing was certain. He was about to face the war he'd never left behind. John Carver's boots echoed on the cracked sidewalk as he followed the boy down the narrow street toward number 14 in Lafayette Square. The dusk had thickened, the last slivers of grey light fading into a cold, inky blue, and the warm glow spilling from the windows of the row houses felt like a world he didn't belong to. Each step forward was a battle, his legs heavy as if wading through the muddy trenches of a memory he couldn't outrun. The envelope in his jacket seemed to pulse against his chest. Danny's words, "Lev, not just for you, but for me too," looping in his mind like a broken record. He clenched his fists, the dull ache in his knuckles grounding him against the rising tide of dread. What waited at the end of this street? A piece of Danny he wasn't ready to face? A truth that would unravel the fragile threads holding him together? His breath came in shallow bursts, the autumn chill biting at his lungs. But he kept moving, driven by a force older than fear. Duty, or perhaps the ghost of a promise he'd made long ago. The boy, whose name John still hadn't asked, kept glancing back at him, his young face a mix of hope and uncertainty. John couldn't meet those eyes for long. They saw too much, pierced too deep into the cracks he'd spent years hiding. Instead, he focused on the uneven pavement, the faint hum of life behind those lit windows, families at dinner, voices murmuring over the clink of dishes, lives so far removed from the cold steel of the bridge he'd called home. His stomach twisted, not just from hunger, but from the weight of stepping into something he couldn't control. What if Walter Klein looked at him and saw not a hero, but a failure? What if whatever Danny had left behind was a reminder of all John had lost, not just his brother in arms, but the man he used to be? The thought clawed at him sharper than the wind, and for a fleeting second he considered turning back, disappearing into the shadows of St. Louis where no one could find him again. But the boy's small frame ahead, the determined set of his shoulders, kept pulling him forward, a lifeline he couldn't let go. They stopped in front of a weathered brick house, its paint peeling at the edges, a faint light flickering through the drawn curtains. Number 14. The boy hesitated, his hand hovering over the rusted doorknob, before turning to John with a nervous half smile. "He's been waiting a long time for this, mister. Just don't be mad if he says stuff that don't make sense right away. He's real tired, but he's got a good heart." John nodded, though the gesture felt hollow. His throat was tight, words trapped behind a wall of fear and years of silence. The boy pushed the door open, the hinges creaking like a warning, and stepped inside, gesturing for John to follow. The air inside was warm, heavy with the scent of old wood and something medicinal, a sharp tang that stung his nostrils. The narrow hallway was dim, lined with faded photographs in crooked frames. Faces John didn't recognize, moments of a life he hadn't lived. His boots thudded against the worn floorboards, each sound amplifying the hammering in his chest. He felt exposed, out of place, an intruder in a space that held no trace of the war he carried with him. Yet somewhere in this house was a man who knew that war, who knew Danny, who held a piece of a past John had buried under layers of dust and despair. The boy led him to a small living room at the back, where a frail figure sat hunched in a recliner near a cracked window. Walter Klein. The man's face was gaunt, his skin sallow under the weak lamplight, his hands trembling as they rested on a folded blanket across his lap. But his eyes, sharp despite the weight of illness, locked on to John the moment he stepped into the room, and in that gaze, John saw recognition, pain, and something deeper, something like relief. A worn oxygen tank sat beside the chair, tubes snaking up to Walter's nose, his breath shallow and labored. The sight hit John like a punch, stirring memories of field hospitals, of men clinging to life while the world burned around them. He stopped in the doorway, his scarred hand instinctively brushing against the envelope in his jacket, as if it could shield him from whatever was coming. "John Carver," Walter rasped, his voice thin but firm, cutting through the stifling air. "I'll be damned. Thought I'd never see you again. Thought maybe you'd gone where none of us could reach you." John's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into his palm. He didn't know what to say, didn't trust his voice not to crack if he tried. Instead, he gave a short, stiff nod, his eyes darting to the floor before forcing them back to Walter. The old man's gaze softened, though it didn't lose its edge, as if he could see straight through the layers of grit and grief John wore like armor. "Sit," Walter said, gesturing to a sagging armchair across from him. "I ain't got much time to waste, and neither do you, I reckon. Mikey here, my grandson. He told you about the letter, but there's more. Always is, ain't there?" John sat, the chair creaking under his weight, his body tense as if braced for an ambush. Mikey lingered near the doorway, shifting uneasily, his young face pale in the dim light. Walter reached beside him, his trembling hands pulling out a small dented metal box from under the blanket. The sight of it sent a jolt through John, his breath catching as he recognized the kind of container soldiers used for keepsakes in the field. Rugged, unassuming, a vault for things too precious to lose. Walter's fingers fumbled with the latch, the effort drawing a wheeze from his chest, but he managed to open it, revealing a folded piece of fabric and something that glinted faintly in the lamplight. John's stomach dropped, a cold sweat breaking out across his brow. He knew somehow, before Walter even spoke, that this was Danny's doing, another piece of a brother reaching out from beyond to shake the foundations of the life he'd tried to forget. "Danny gave me this before that last run," Walter said, his voice cracking on the name. "Said if he didn't make it, I was to keep it safe till I found you. Took me too damn long, Carver. I tried after the war, but you'd vanished. No record, no trace, like you wanted to be a ghost. Then a buddy at the VA mentioned a vet matching your scars down by the river. I knew it had to be you. Had to be." Walter unfolded the fabric, revealing a small, worn American flag. The kind draped over caskets, the kind handed to grieving families with trembling hands. Beneath it was a medal, its ribbon faded but unmistakable. A purple heart. Danny's purple heart. John's vision blurred, his chest constricting as if a vice had clamped around his heart. He remembered the day Danny had earned it, the shrapnel that had torn through his shoulder weeks before his death, the way he'd grinned through the pain and said, "Hell, Carver, just a scratch. We got bigger fights ahead." Now, here it was, a tangible piece of that sacrifice, lying in Walter's frail hands like an accusation or a plea. "He wanted you to have it," Walter continued, his voice softer now, heavy with the weight of years. "Said you'd know what to do with it. Said you carried enough for all of us, and this was his way of saying thanks. For everything. For not letting him die alone out there, even if you couldn't pull him back." The words sliced through John, deeper than any blade, tearing open wounds he'd thought long scabbed over. He hadn't saved Danny. He'd been there, screaming his name into the smoke and chaos, dragging himself through the wreckage, but it hadn't been enough. Yet here was Walter, telling him Danny hadn't blamed him, hadn't left this world thinking John had failed. And the flag, the medal, they weren't just relics, they were a burden, a trust, a final mission from a brother who'd believed in him even in his last moments. John's hand shook as he reached out, hesitating before taking the items from Walter, the fabric coarse against his calloused fingers, the medal cold as if it carried the chill of that desert night. A sob clawed its way up his throat, but he swallowed it, his face a mask of stone even as his eyes burned. "I don't deserve this," John rasped, his voice raw, barely above a whisper. "I didn't save him. I let him down, all of them. You don't know what I've done, Walter, what I've become." Walter leaned forward as much as his frail body allowed, his gaze piercing. "I know more than you think, son. I know war chews up good men and spits out shells. I know you've been hiding under that bridge, thinking you ain't worth a damn. But I also know what Danny saw in you, why he trusted you with this. You didn't let him down, John. You survived. And that's a fight most don't win. He'd be pissed if he saw you giving up now." The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as Walter's words echoed Danny's letter, a double blow to the defenses John had built. Mikey stepped closer, his small hand reaching out to touch Walter's shoulder, as if to steady him, but his eyes stayed on John, wide and searching. John stared at the flag in his hands, the faded stars and stripes blurring as memories flooded in. Danny's laugh over a crackling radio, the weight of his arm slung over John's shoulder after a long march, the silence after the explosion that stole him away. And with those memories came the weight of failure, not just to Danny but to himself, to the man who'd earned the Silver Star, who'd once believed in something worth fighting for. He'd run from that man, buried him under the bridge with the ghosts of his past. But now, holding Danny's legacy, he felt the stirrings of a fight he thought he'd lost. A fight to claw his way back. "I ain't the man Danny thought I was," John said finally, his voice trembling but resolute, meeting Walter's gaze. "But I made him a promise in that letter, to live for him. I've been failing at that every damn day since he's been gone. I don't know if I can do it right, but I'll try. For him. For all of them." Walter nodded slowly, a ghost of a smile touching his weathered lips, though his eyes shone with unshed tears. "That's all any of us can do, John, try. One step at a time. You got a long road, but you ain't walking it alone no more. Mikey here, he's been my strength. And I reckon he's got a piece of yours now, too, if you'll let him." John looked at the boy, whose nervous expression had softened into something like awe. For the first time, John felt the weight of being seen, not as a shadow under a bridge, but as someone who mattered, someone whose fight still meant something. He didn't know if he could live up to it, didn't know if the nightmares would ever stop, but the spark of purpose, dim as it was, flickered brighter than it had in years. He folded the flag carefully, tucking the medal inside, and slipped them into his jacket alongside the letter, the weight of them a reminder, not just of loss, but of what he owed. Not just to Danny, but to himself. In the days that followed, John didn't return to the bridge. The decision hadn't come easy. Every instinct screamed to retreat to the familiar cold, to the solitude where pain couldn't grow. But each time he thought of disappearing, Danny's words, live, stopped him cold. So he stayed near Lafayette Square, crashing on Walter's sagging couch, the old man's gruff company a tether to a world he'd forgotten how to navigate. Walter didn't have long, the doctor said, and John found himself sitting with him late into the night, swapping stories of the war, not just the blood and loss, but the small human moments, the ones that kept them going. Mikey was there too, listening wide-eyed, sometimes asking questions that cut too close. But John answered as best he could, finding a strange comfort in the boy's curiosity, in the way it forced him to remember he wasn't just a ghost. His routine shifted, slow and painful, like resetting a broken bone. Mornings, he walked Mikey to school, the boys' chatter about hockey and math homework, filling the silence John had grown used to. Afternoons, he helped Walter with small chores, fixing a leaky faucet or hauling trash to the curb, tasks that felt foreign but grounding, each one a tiny victory over the numbness. He started going to the VA again, not because he thought they could fix him, but because he owed it to Danny to try, to face the paperwork, the counseling, the long waits in sterile rooms that smelled of antiseptic and regret. The nightmares didn't stop, and the sound of a car backfire still sent him reeling, but he began to write them down, shaky notes in a cheap notebook Walter gave him, as if naming the ghosts might loosen their grip. But the biggest shift came on a quiet Sunday, when Walter, weaker than ever, handed John a bus ticket and an address scrawled on a scrap of paper. Danny's grave, in a small cemetery outside Kansas City. "Go say goodbye proper," Walter had wheezed, his hand gripping John's with surprising strength. "You've been carrying him in pieces. Time to lay some of that down. Not all, mind you. Never all. But enough to breathe again." John resisted at first, the thought of standing over that patch of earth more terrifying than any battlefield. But Walter's words and Mikey's quiet nod from the doorway pushed him past the fear. The bus ride was long, each mile a weight on his chest, the flag and medal in his jacket a constant reminder of why he was there. When he finally stood before the simple headstone, Daniel Harper, beloved son and soldier, dates that marked too short a life, John's knees nearly buckled. He didn't cry, not at first. He just stood there, the wind rustling the dead leaves around him, clutching the folded flag like a lifeline. Then slowly he knelt, his scarred hands trembling as he placed Danny's purple heart on the grave, the medal glinting faintly in the pale morning light. A sacrifice, a renunciation of the guilt he'd worn like chains, or at least a step toward letting it go. Not all of it, never all, as Walter had said, but enough to feel the air in his lungs again. "I'm sorry, brother," John whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "I couldn't save you, but I'm going to try to live like you wanted. So I owe you that much. I'll see you again someday. Till then, rest easy." He stayed there for hours, until the cold seeped into his bones, until the first tears finally came, silent and steady, washing away years of dust, if not the ache. When he stood, leaving the medal behind, he felt lighter, not whole but less broken, as if a piece of the war had been buried with Danny at last. The flag he kept, a promise to carry forward, to remember without drowning. Back in St. Louis, weeks turned to months, and John kept moving forward, one halting step at a time. Walter passed not long after the trip, a peaceful end in his sleep, with John and Mikey at his side. The loss cut deep, another name added to the list of ghosts. But John didn't run from it. He stayed, helped Mikey's family with the arrangements, stood tall at the funeral even as his heart ached. He found a small room to rent near Lafayette Square, using VA benefits he'd fought to reinstate, and took odd jobs, cleaning lots, hauling boxes, work that tired his body but steadied his mind. Mikey still came by, dragging John to blues games or just to talk, a bond forged in a moment under a bridge that neither would forget. And slowly, so slowly, John began to look at the gateway arch without lowering his eyes, seeing not just a taunt, but a quiet dare to keep going. On a crisp spring morning, months after that first step into Walter's house, John walked to the Mississippi River, not to the bridge, but to a quiet spot along the levee. In his hands, he held the faded photo from his platoon days, the one he hadn't looked at in years, the grins of his brothers in arms frozen in a time before the world shattered. Beside it was Danny's flag, still carrying the weight of memory. He didn't scatter the photo or the flag into the water, didn't bury them in the mud. Instead, he sat on a weathered bench, tracing the faces in the photo with a scarred thumb, letting the river's ceaseless flow mark the passage of time. Mikey joined him after school, sitting close, holding a small toy soldier Walter had given him, a silent tribute to the stories he'd heard, the heroes he now knew. The boy's presence was a comfort, a reminder that some scars could be bridges, not just walls, connecting the past to something new. And as they sat there, the river rolling on, John thought of how time moves like water, relentless, carving through even the hardest stone, wearing down edges, carrying away debris if you let it. War had taken much from him, left marks that would never fade, but it hadn't taken everything. Healing wasn't a finish line, he realized, but a current, pulling you forward even when you felt stuck. Rebeginning wasn't about erasing the past, but building on its ruins, one small, stubborn step at a time. In the quiet, with the boy beside him and the ghosts of his brothers in his heart, John felt not just the ache of loss, but the faint warmth of hope, a fragile thing, but real, whispering that maybe, just maybe, he could live again. To anyone out there who felt John's story in your bones, who knows the weight of carrying invisible wounds, I've got a small ask. Comment. I believe in healing below if this touched you. Share it with someone who needs to hear they're not alone in their fight. And if you want to follow more stories of struggle and redemption, hit that subscribe button. There's so much more to come, and I'd hate for you to miss it.